Nice. I'm going to take over the screen
Yeah, let
share
me just
if
drop
I
that.
may. Let me do get that. Hopefully that has done the trick. Cool. Is that good? See your screen?
Yeah, loud
That's
and clear.
cool. So, yeah, thanks to the folks that have, yeah, we teed up last time to have a few people talk about this subject, and that was really good. We went. I've tried to summarize a quite extensive set of discussion points that was done by email, yeah, I guess our experts that were involved with that, yeah, do pipe up if you see anything that isn't ringing true. Um, so basically, this was examining the inclusion of a specimen reference in a request, and the details of that specimen. So basically, through the discussion, it was, we have our more simple case where there's a request by itself, basically, where a specimen is going to be collected at a collection centre later based on that request. I think that's pretty typical community requesting case, and it is essentially doesn't need a specimen reference as part of that request. Essentially, once you're at the collection centre, it becomes laboratory business in terms of collecting the specimen and creating anything associated, any information associated with that. And then we had the case where there was a specimen at the time of making the request or associated with a request. And basically, there were cases where there were cases where the specimen was collected and physically delivered with a request, and in that case, there was still no real information added to the requesting system detail, so it wasn't really part of the request as such, and that was then handled through the lab and collection centre process to be able to enter the details of the specimens, even though they were coming, with the request and weren't collected by the lab centres themselves. That was something that then became part of the pathology information system record, but through the lab processing those specimens on receipt. However, there was noted that there were cases, especially in more closed system usage, especially within hospitals, but may be relevant to other settings as well, where the requesting system was essentially part of the collection process, and records about specimen details were included in those, collected in those systems, so were available to be part of a request if we wanted to include that information. So primarily, there was a need for specimen details, or a possibility that specimen details would be available at the time of requesting and could be part of the transmitted record. Do you want to add anything, Angus, or anyone, Dan, or
I
Dan's here?
I had one more thought just as you're reading it, Brett,
Yep.
and
Yep.
that's because I saw David Heacock in the meeting, and he's going to pipe up
Yep.
about
Yep.
inter-lab requesting, like send,
Yeah,
which I'd also say is maybe out of scope. But in that
Yep.
case, you would have a specimen because you're
Yep.
literally in the lab sending it to another lab, and you have the specimen.
Sure.
So I'm just pointing that out, really.
Yeah, sure. I think that's a very good point. That was, in my original idea, that was definitely something that is relevant, and we've kind of talked about, maybe putting that stuff out of scope at this point. But, and I think too, though, I'm interested because, there was definitely some discussion about when the specimens exist, and as part of like a clinician collected specimen, or part of a existing collection workflow where the requesting system knows about it. The and primarily that was very much understood in a hospital setting. That was part of kind of how it worked. These orders were made. That was part of the collection process, and then that was passed over to the lab to do business. But there were also noted some possible other kind of specialist settings where this would happen, and things like that as well, where it's quite possible that systems could do this. So I think primarily there's probably a decision to be made about is this something, because I'll move on to the next slide. So primarily with this the service request specimen, there's a question about like whether this is in scope, because I think at one point Angus read what our scope was, and it didn't include hospital requesting in the so that was a consideration. But I think it's whether people see this as being a an optional but useful set of sort of capability that's defined, and whether and probably that leads on to a discussion about how obliged are people to actually populate this information. So I just wanted to say sort of move on to say, well, if people see the value, it's whether we think, because I think it's clear that there is a case where this would happen. There are cases where this might be relevant. The question is like whether people think they would like to have this capability in the R1 of eRequesting, at least have this guidance in the spec. So I might put it to the group and maybe call for a yes/no vote. Michael Wilson.
I just want to sort of clarify here that service request dot specimen will rely heavily on the business process, because that assumes the specimen has already been taken before the service request is created.
Yeah.
Because otherwise you have to update the service request to do this after it has been created. Whereas the other one, the specimen request, can be added at any time after the service request has been created, because it references back to the service request. So I think that's just important to note, that the first one does assume the specimen's already been taken before you're creating the request, even though it might happen in the same event, that it's actually the business process is you've taken the specimen and now I'm creating the service request.
Yeah, that's actually a good point, because that's probably even relevant for the hospital setting, right, where there is a request perhaps even before the collection is made. And anyway, I had Michael Osborne next.
I'm just wondering what the expectation is on the laboratory, what they do with this information, because obviously there's a lot of standardization we're going to have to go down if we're going to put this in the spec and make it must support. So there'll be a heap of mapping, because everybody's got different types of specimens that, different tubes, different vendors of tubes and all that sort of stuff. I just wonder whether this is a step too far.
Yeah, I think it's a fair point. David Haycock.
Yeah, I was just wondering if we had a clinical view in the room about whether not supporting this in R1 was going to create any significant headaches in a clinical setting when you're trying to create a request and map the specimens that you've taken and package everything up. Is this going to break anything? And for the providers as well. Have we got an opinion from anyone in that area?
I hear no one. Yeah, I think too, like from the use cases even that we've got, this is not really specifically mentioned in the use cases. So I think it is very much perhaps a workflow benefit maybe here, but and I guess in that way, like I think even Michael Wilson's point on just what it and Michael Osborne's point, and so on just how this gets implemented is a fair question, I think.
Yeah. I'm just curious to know if it's going to fall apart if we don't do it. So if a clinician in their rooms takes a urine sample, prints out a request form, puts a sample into a bag with a printed request form, the courier picks it up, it goes to a lab, are we going to have problems? Are we going to have significant problems that need to be addressed now? Or can it be something that we can add to over time without creating more problems because we've got this gap?
Yeah. That's a fair question. I'll go to Andy and see what Andy has to say.
I wouldn't argue one way or the other about whether or not we should be including this, but I just wanted to point out that I think we've got to be quite careful about how we interpret the business process, as in the physical process of collection, and how the service, the order is actually instigated versus what happens in an IT sense with the relative ordering of the creation of a specimen resource versus a service request resource versus a task resource, and whether or not it happens in this order or that order. I think it's less clear. Often we can't be explicit, I think, in what the sequencing of FHIR resource creation is, and nor is it necessarily relevant compared to what happens in the physical world.
Okay. Angus?
Just make a comment on the back of what Michael Osborne said about the complexity of dealing with the specimen logic. And I don't think that's a burden we'd take on, even if we took on specimen. There's no way we're going to define what tubes are required for what tests. And I see this as just a placeholder to hold information about a specimen that exists with the request, how that specimen exists with the request, which specimens they are. I don't think anyone's proposing that we'd cover that. We're just saying that a ordered test may have a representation of a sample, and we're not even going to say any rules about it, right? You could order an MSU and the sample might be a blood. That'd be completely wrong, but we're not going to go into the level of what is right. It is just a statement that says this test has this sample for good or bad. So I just wanted to say I don't feel by taking this on, we're going into that complexity. We may stumble into it a little bit about the properties on sample.
Yeah.
Because then people are going to start coming in with all their use cases, like I want many samples that are timed for this test. And I don't think that'll be too bad, because I think we'll have properties on there for like time of collection and things like that. I guess I'm just separating that by taking on specimen as a resource doesn't imply that we're going to then define the logic about what specimen and how.
Yeah, cool. Danielle?
So, in order to somewhat draw this conversation to a bit of a conclusion, we've talked about specimen in, I think, maybe at least 5 of our meetings, and kind of echoing what Angus has said. The interest has been limited to the ability to associate already captured specimens with a request. Like at max, the things that have been talked about consistently that would be like kind of the limit of our interest are identifiers and maybe collection date time. And that's been echoed even in one of our very first meetings where we talked about things that are out of scope, which was totally the specimen collection workflow. But some of this information we went, well, it might be useful and we should consider whether or not we want it in R1. And I think that's actually the conversation we're having now. And I want to pose that to the group. Could I ask people to put their hand up if they think it's important in R1 if we fold in or look for support on that kind of level of information about specimen. Like if specimens are coming with that request order, the identifier and maybe the date time, is that something that we think is an R1? Or can we just, I guess, leave that out of R1, noting we are keeping out the workflow?
I just add that I think notes, I think if we're adding it, I think note on specimen is relevant because I think one of the use cases for adding it is that people collect two samples like swabs or a dermatologist is cutting lumps off you and he wants to say blah, blah, blah about this specimen and blah, blah, blah about that specimen. And it's too much for him to write on the specimen because it's a tiny little jar, but he wants to inform you about where the location he took it from and maybe what it looked like or something. And he's trying to find a place to write that. And today we would just write that in clinical notes, right? And they would do something strange like draw number 1, 2, 3 on the specimens, and then clinical notes, they'd go specimen 1, blah, 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 so specimen 2, blah, blah, blah.
I mean, just even backing out of that, is that kind of, because I don't want to, like, before we even go to which bare bones part of specimen, are we actually interested in any information about the specimen coming through? Can you put your hand up just to gauge an interest from the group? If in R1, we want, whether that's identifier, whether that's a bit of notes about specimen, is this a thing we need to be in R1, or can we move that to the R2 space? So I'll just give that a little bit for people to pop their hand up. Because otherwise we can park that conversation and move that into the R2 space. And so far, only one person has put their hand up. So that suggests to me, whether it's notes or identifier or otherwise, we don't need to consider it.
I think the question should be from a pathology perspective, does it break your workflow if you've got an electronic request coming in that's printed out with a specimen in a bag and you don't have any electronic information about a specimen? Can you still cope with that?
Fair enough.
And from Sonic's point of view, that's what we do today. We don't get specimen information.
There you go. So now we've got, I think...
Sorry, also, Daniel. Yeah, Daniel, question: how many of places will be able to provide such information? Should it even be relevant for our one? That's a question.
Well, that's kind of what we're asking. How many people want this information, whether they can do it now or not? Is this crucial to us? Do we think it's crucial for R1, whether you can do it now or not? And so far, this seems to be clearly, looking at the lack of people putting their hands up, something we can just move on from and go, this is R2. Or rather something to consider in a future version, because no one's putting their hand up except for maybe 1 or 2 people. David, did you have something you wanted to say on specimen?
Well, I think, so the question is, you know, does the system break if we don't have this? And I guess the reason I haven't been putting my hand up is I don't feel like I know enough about how lab workflows operate to make a call on that. And I think that's in some senses a weakness of, you know, people voting on whether or not, because if I don't feel like I'm equipped, like in terms of my knowledge of how these systems work to make a call, we might end up making the wrong call. Like what if it is that, you know, we do this and then down the track, it's like, oh, well, actually we need this. Like if there's no one who can actually answer that question definitively, yes or no.
Well, I'll comment on that and say, a decision we make now is not set in stone. We can come back to things if it turns out it is important. And there are a number of pathology labs on the line who aren't putting their hand up for this.
They're not the lab managers who sort of understand, you know, if this information is missing, actually that's going to be a disaster or, you know, significant additional work. Like that's the perspective that we need. We don't,
Well, I can vouch for Sonic. I can vouch for 1/3 of the industry.
Jojo?
Yeah, I think with this issue, we need to look at a bit more broader context in the sense that there is an inpatient and an outpatient workflow. For an outpatient workflow, having a specimen identification in the eRequest may not be relevant or may not be ready today, but certainly from an inpatient in a hospital setting, when we are sending pathology request, that information is already generated and could be available. So yeah, I agree with David that we don't want to be coming to a broad decision saying that R1 doesn't include this when it could potentially include it, but for a small subset, and then R2 could be a broader for this scope. So I'm just happy to hear what others would think.
I think that's really the question, because it's like I think I think at the moment there are other methods used to our patient to convey some of this information, right? And some of that's actually physically having the specimen with details on it. So there is a method to achieve what needs to be achieved when receiving those specimens, and it's much more, I think, common in the inpatient setting to have this information in a system, right? That's actually part of the requesting and collection process, which is more on just the regular workflows. So that would really be my question, is about does the group want to put it in scope for R1 and say yes, we will define this, and I think that actually leads on to some of my other questions about separating this particular set of information and obligations around it versus the regular requesting obligations, right? So I think it goes back to Danielle's question about probably a yay or nay at this point. So it's whether we're going to attempt to include it for the R1. And as Danielle has said, like, that doesn't mean it can never happen. It just means that we're going to park it till it comes up again.
Because one of the things, if we do say we agree, means we need to make decisions on it. And if we don't have the right people in the forum, then my question is for those people who are pathology lab vendors, can you bring the right people to the forum? We did advertise we'd be talking about specimen today. And if we advertise at the right time, can you bring the right people to that meeting then to go, what do we include? If we're interested to do it. I mean, it doesn't mean it can't come up again, obviously, because we are going through what are we interested in working on now? And that's going to be a continuous thing that the technical design group at any point can come back and go, well, we weren't interested in it then, but it turns out it is actually meaningful now to talk about. It's not like we're completely closing a door. So maybe I should ask the question again. Oh no, Andy, your hand is up.
I was just going to say, I think when we get in these kind of discussions, it does beg the question that is there a missing principle in this, for instance, what the intent is around how paper and digital are to work hand in hand for the next little while going forward. Is if there is a physical paper form that is included, for instance, with the specimen as it goes off to the lab, should we be then saying, well, if it's required in that sense for the paper pathway, should we also then be making sure that there is a digital equivalent of that? I've had these discussions with David before, because I think the coexistence of paper and digital, unless it becomes a random thing and we just kind of arbitrarily make calls, we need, I think, some direction to be agreed around what drives the other.
Let's see. Daniel.
Forgive me if I'm stating something obvious here, but as the person that raised their hand on in response to Danielle, I have very narrow but very detailed experience in the digital pathology space. So I'm happy for this to be optional, out of scope for this. But I think what I'd like to say is, if, for example, I put together a digital histology downstream system, I would want to have any guidance there from the national level so that it didn't break further down the track. Now, that may be quite unnecessary to consider. As Angus said, very limited necessity other than including this at this stage. Maybe a date, time, and some definition of what is in the specimen, but that would be all that was there. So it may be unnecessary to make it more explicit than that. But I think given, and I think somebody last week said the hospital system would require it, that would mean then there's going to be a downstream system that puts in place specimen. And is it important at this stage? The only question to resolve, I think, scope-wise, is it important for us to define anything that we want a downstream system to have, or can we just say that's something we can define later on?
Okay. So I don't have a horse in this race. So I think, and there is a fair point, I think, to what Andy was saying as well, about if the intent is that we would move to a completely electronic requesting process, and this is part of that necessity, that's actually a good reason to have it.
Can I just say, when we have physical samples, we don't have a purely electronic pathway. We have physical things that have to be tagged and bagged and moved from place to place. So it needs to be considered.
Can I ask how we see the profile used going forward? So we come up with a Spark profile, then maybe the government creates some system. Are they just going to say use that Spark profile, or are they going to then inherit off our profile and make decisions about each property? So like if we put specimen in as optional, does that automatically mean that does an implementation of a system then have to make the decision itself?
Yeah, I think this, like, there are some levers. We can write our own actors and our own roles in this, and we might want to split the requester from a requester with a specimen, and actually have them as separate roles. And then there's some ability then, I guess, to opt in or out of that as a system, right? Because obviously if you have a requesting system and this is just not a thing, it's not really relevant to you. But if it does then, I think the actual conformance requirements, I think, are yet to be really, we are not defining what the Commonwealth is going to ask of you, but we're giving a framework that the Commonwealth will probably use to make that assertion later. Stuart.
Thanks, Brett. Sorry, so just in the interest of time, is there an action that we can take today, or does this need to be moved to a different meeting?
Yeah, honestly, I think we probably need to make a call, at least, of whether we want to continue to have this discussion on specimen in R1 or park it for R2. That's really the primary decision.
Mm-hmm.
Or park it until it gets raised as directly of interest from people.
Yeah, because I feel like there's definitely like a whole bunch of more basic service request questions that we could answer before we get to this. So I think I'm back to. I don't have a horse in this game, so I don't really want to raise a motion. But somebody, yeah.
Do we do as Danielle said, do we just kick this down the road, not work on specimen, but not make the decision? And if we get to a point, if this keeps coming up, if people keep going, but specimens, and we keep having this conversation, it kind of highlights we need to make a decision about it, and it probably highlights that we probably need specimen included. But if we continue on and we get 6 months in and no one wants to talk about specimen, then we at the end go, well, we don't need it for R1.
So can I motion then that we park the specimen discussion for now, and that might mean it's out of R1, but we're choosing to park the specimen discussion until someone is raising that there is actually a serious need for it to be in R1. Is anyone happy to second that? Because I'm happy to motion that.
I'll second it.
I don't actually think you can, Stuart, as chair.
No,
I think someone else has to.
That was worth a shot,
try,
right?
Stuart. Nice
I'm
try.
happy.
Yeah, always have a go.
Danielle, I'm happy to second it.
Okay, thanks, David. I'll hand it over to you, Stuart, to do the formal voting.
Oh, awesome. Thank you. All right. So we're just going to do the vote on the motion for parking specimen. Not necessarily moving it out of R1, but we're going to move it down the road for a little bit until it's either raised again or until something comes up that makes this required. Okay. There we go. All right. So we'll start with anybody that is voting in the negative. Just raise your hand and we'll take a count. Okay. 4.
Okay.
Affirmative, voting 4.
Hang on. Negative. These are the people voting negative.
Oh, hang on. What am I voting?
Hang on. All right. Everyone hands down. Sorry.
Sorry, I thought you were saying that these are the people voting negative or against that motion. Isn't
They
it?
were. There was one hand up. It was Andy's. All right. We'll take it again just so that we can be certain. So anybody voting in the negative on this motion, raise your hand. All right, just the one. Thank you. Anybody voting in the affirmative, raise your hand. Call it there at 15. Thank you. And the rest are abstaining. Perfect. Thank you, everybody. So we will move that down the road. I'd say that was pretty overwhelming, and we will come back to that if and when we need to. So next up, then, we will pass to Kylen, who has a presentation for us here. Kylen, I'll pass to you whenever you're ready. Just yell out, and we'll get the screen shared.
Yep, I'm here. So I think if you stop sharing, then I can try and share.
Jumped out now. We should be good to go.
I suppose I can just share. Can you see my screen okay?
Certainly can, loud and clear, okay. Kylen.
Perfect. Yep. Thank you. So I just wanted to give an update, and then I think we wanted to give opportunity for any questions if people had any. So the AU eRequest DI, or Data for Interoperability Release 1, has been open for community comment. I might just go to the next one. So the AU eRequest DI R1 is available now on the Spark website. On the website, you'll find a PDF version of it, a prep sheet if you like, and a link to the feedback form. So we're very much following the process that we use for AU CDI Release 1. The review period will be open for 4 weeks. So I think it's been open for a week already. So it's closing on Friday, the 14th of June. However, if you do want to respond but don't, have timing issues, or there's a group of you that want to have a look at it, just let us know and we can do something. We can have a chat and find sort of like a compromise. So just reach out if there's anything there, if you have questions. So just in terms of content, this is the AU eRequest DI R1 draft scope. So just like AU CDI, it's kind of really much kind of leveraging the existing stuff. So AU core, that is, the patient condition, all of those things. And we are also building upon the AU CDI. So you can see here on the right, we've incorporated 3 things from AU CDI. So that's just the problem diagnosis, the adverse reaction risk summary, and sex and gender. So those were things that were agreed and included in R1, and then were deemed appropriate for inclusion in the eRequesting. So the new data groups that are in eRequesting are the service request generic, and that's that idea of a repeating request template, I guess, and then just put it against the pathology and the medical imaging use cases. So you can see that the pathology test request has a few additional things like fasting status and test name, and medical imaging also has test name, target body site, modality, contrast use. With the work that we've done, we've very much tried to stay out of workflow, the administrative, the billing, all of that kind of stuff. However, there were some things that were really of interest to the clinicians, and they made it very clear that it needed to be in there. So there are some things on this scope, like the distribution list, the urgent contact list, and the billing guidance that we just wanted to note that it was really relevant to the clinicians, but we won't be defining them, that we just wanted to have them in there because it was raised almost, particularly at the beginning when we're doing the scoping, it was raised several times. So that's that one in there. And then the last data group or data model that's in there is the implanted device summary. So that one was really relevant for the radiology, the imaging requests. And that is just a simplified model, just a very simple model with just the device. It should be device type name, so it's a higher level name, not like the identifying name, a status, an overall comment, and last updated. So it is quite a simple data model. It doesn't have it doesn't have a huge amount of things in it. It is just a starter. Just, I guess, out of interest, there were some other things that we did propose to the CDG to include, because we did look at the forms and was looking at existing information on the form. So one of the questions we did ask the group was whether we should include pregnancy information, menstruation information, as well as the device part. We asked whether those should be included as either questionnaire, like a yes/no type answer, or as a fully modeled sort of data model for both pathology and for imaging. Of everything, the group decided that only devices should be included for a request, and they just wanted a simple model to start. For pregnancy and menstruation information, they didn't think, they thought it would be better for it to actually go into the AUCDI future releases, probably R2, and to be left out of the eRequesting. So it was more about whether they saw that they needed it to be transferred as structured data in an eRequest. There was talk about how that is often just not filled in, or it is actually the collector who then does it and asks those questions again. So because of that, because of their decision, we did leave it out of AU eRequesting, and we have put it in the backlog for AU CDI R1. I think that's all I wanted to say. Heather, was there anything else you wanted to add to that?
No, you covered it well. Thanks, Colleen.
So that's all I kind of had to share with the group. And if people have questions, that's fine. If people wanted to have a read through and Heather and I come back for another session, we can do that too. We're kind of open to help out. Oh, Angus, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I've provided my feedback, but I really struggle with this pregnancy not being included. And even just your description then, you presented them a complex pregnancy model and they said, oh, no, that's all too hard. We just want something simple. So you left it out. But then you included other things. Like in my view, and I'm not everyone, I thought pregnancy was kind of like top of the list. And yet now we've chucked it out and chucked in other things that we didn't necessarily need because the pregnancy model got so complex and they wanted something simple. I'm still like asking for something simple.
We offered them the questionnaire as well as an option of a yes/no answer, and we offered them the model as well. We asked them if they wanted it as a questionnaire yes/no, or if they wanted it as a model, or if they wanted to leave it for the backlog, and it was voted to leave it for the backlog. So we did give them the option. Like, I appreciate where you're coming from because that's currently what's on many of the forms. But we did ask, and they actually didn't request for the yes, no either.
Can I just chip
the
in
other
there?
things then overrode pregnancy, so that more so than pregnancy status, they then wanted allergies and alerts, device problems and conditions. They were higher on the agenda than some pregnancy status is what I'm struggling with.
Angus, can I just respond there? It's pregnancy is a useful thing. It's clearly been there a long, long time. I presented a slide, and I'm happy to share it if you give me sharing rights, that talk them through it. And we talk through the yes, no. And actually, it's not about whether it's simple or complex. It's actually what the semantics are and how to accurately represent the information they wanted. And yes, no just doesn't cut it.
I think it very much cuts it for starting the conversation when the patient presents. Oh, it seems that you may be pregnant. Let's talk about that.
The clinicians don't agree with you.
So it's better to just say nothing.
Yes, exactly what they were saying. For the moment, it's better to say nothing because, yes, I'm happy to share. If you give me permissions, I'll show you and just look at the questions that we proposed. Is that something?
Yeah, look, and we may be going off topic. Like, I did provide my feedback in the thing. It just hit me again with Kaylin describing it, that it feels like we made it too complex and then dropped it out because it was overly complex and neglected the fact that I think
it's not about complexity, Angus. It's not about complexities. It's not simple versus complex. It's versus accurate data. And yes, no does not accurately convey what the clinicians need if they're sending information about pregnancy. No, medical legally is dynamite. And any clinician who will say someone is not pregnant is in trouble potentially. So they don't want it. Is yes enough? What about if they might be pregnant? What if it's likely that they're pregnant? What if they're trying to get pregnant? All of which are ways that, or is information that needs to be conveyed from a clinical safety point of view as well.
So you've now put it on all our collection staff have to now, they have to, without any prompt, determine whether a patient may or may not be pregnant. Like, it's now not coming from the clinician because they just don't want to tell us, even though they think they are. You know, like, we now have to make that decision on our own accord.
The feedback,
no help, no assistance,
was that they very rarely put the checkbox or filled the checkbox. The feedback from the organisations was that they, even if they got something that said someone was pregnant, they still asked again and got more information. And if they didn't get the information, they'd still ask it. So it really wasn't helping having a yes, no.
Would you like me to get statistics from Sonic about how many requests are marked as pregnant?
You can do what you like, Angus. I'm just feeding back what the clinician said. They didn't think it was clinically safe or accurate to send a yes, no response. We offered it to them and they rejected it.
Okay.
So the other things that have been added are things that they did think was clinically relevant and things that we could add safely, and reusing the AECDI things seemed a no-brainer. And certainly the radiologists were very keen to know problem lists and allergy lists and medication lists and all of these kinds of things that help them make decisions around contrast and renal function for when they're giving contrast, etc. And the medical device one has certainly been seen as a high priority, especially from TGA, and the radiologists were very keen to start to get that model. I understand that it's unusual. I understand it's not the usual way we do things about taking information out. And I think it's actually showing that the CDG is doing their job in shaping what the clinical information is that's relevant for exchange. But yeah, it probably feels quite uncomfortable. Thanks.
Cool, thank you, Heather. So, sorry, just to segue really quickly, we've got Danielle who's going to provide a little bit of sort of context to this discussion for anybody that's new or hasn't been following along. Just to keep everybody updated in the loop. We need to keep a lot of these sort of discussions in here and now while we've got everybody in the same room for a change. So I'm just going to pass to Danielle real quick and then we'll come back to this and we will continue this discussion.
Oh, thanks, Stuart. So what we talked about in our last technical design group, which was last Thursday, and when we got the information from Kaylin that we would get an update on eRequesting data for interoperability, because it had just really come out for comment, is that we were looking for this session to be able to have that update walkthrough from the authors. And thanks very much, Kylie and Heather, for coming to this session and making yourself available, and letting the technical design group members to have read through that in between then and now, and come and bring, I guess, any of the questions. And I think some of those questions might be on the nature of what's actually in it content-wise, or how to read it. And some of those I think are going to need to be on the nature of how do we as a technical design group interact with those requirements? How do we provide feedback as well? And so this is our opportunity to ask some of those questions. I see Andy's got his hand up, which is great, because I'm pretty sure Andy's going to lead into some of those. I've got a few of those myself to start asking some of those process questions. So please don't be afraid. If there's anything that you've got thoughts about or queries, whether that's scope or what were we really aiming for, or otherwise, this is, I think, the session that we want to ask them in. So that means that when we've gone through and talked about those, we can start going forwards in our next eRequesting sessions and working through and taking some of those clinical data requirements into our space, now that we've got this sort of baseline snapshot from the eRequesting DI, to work through what that looks like in the FHIR space. So that's that context.
Perfect. Thank you, Danielle. Guys, as well, if you don't have mics or if you're busy, you can just pop your questions in the chat. We are reading them. They are being responded to as well. So, Andy, I'll pass back to you.
Thank you, Stuart. That on one. I understand the opportunity to harvest from the existing AUCDI work. I guess I'm not as sure it's that trivial. So in the requesting CDI document, the reference to condition and one other one kind of implies that we should be incorporating the AU core profiles for condition, etc. And they don't necessarily gel with a very low bar in terms of the existing must supports that are implied from the design decisions that have been made previously. So I guess I am unsure about how the needs of eRequesting can be lighter weight than those that have been agreed to in the AU core work.
Is there anyone that can provide anything to that?
That seems like it's probably more of a core question than an AUCDI question, though I guess there is relationship between that, to talk about the relationship between AUCDI and AU core, and how the decision to place a must support flag on elements in AU core occurs, which has a relationship closely to AUCDI, but isn't the sole governing property for that. And that means that the AU core profiles may have, I think what you're noting there is that there are additional elements with must support, which is flagging that if this information is available in a system, then some support for it is expected to be provided, whatever that means, which is defined by your own IG. And I think that would mean that if we take that information from eRequesting, which is also a decision I think we need to make. So from the eRequesting data for interoperability. We need to take those as requirements in a FHIR space and consider them. Do we accept them? Do we add on to them? Are there elements there that we think are the things that aren't going to be supported in an R1 space? Are they things that we might roadmap onto a later time frame? That will include not just what's directly in eRequesting, but I think also that the things that we inherit from AU Core. And so when it comes to things like AU Core allergy intolerance and AU Core condition, if we chose to keep, which is a question we have to answer in the first place, are we going to keep the structured parts of supporting information? Are there aspects of the AU Core profiles that are beyond what we think is appropriate for R1 for eRequesting? I feel like I've just given like a cascading tree of ifs, but to a degree, that's kind of what it is. We need to make those decisions as a technical design group, I feel, and I think that's also the message that's come through from the clinical design group, is they're identifying a number of things that are really important to clinicians, and that comes to us as a technical design group, and we need to consider those. And I think we need to consider them seriously, but I think there's also this understanding that there might actually be aspects that we can't feasibly support in R1, maybe, depending on what they are. We need to consider them seriously. And if we decide there aren't, then we document that and say why. And we may also, because they've made it relatively clear in their scope, there are other things that will come through to us that are in our technical design group scope. Will be the things that we will add on, and we need to consider those as a technical design group and make the decisions. And I think Heather just gave the thumbs up. So yes, I'm reading that right. So we do have a lot of scope. We just have to take all this in good faith and consider it and provide that information back to the clinical design group. And also, I think, refer any decisions where we're thinking, look, this actually really needs clinical input. I think we need to pass that back to the clinical design group and sometimes even ask for joint sessions or come back and present to them on what might that advice be.
Cool. Thank you, Danielle. Has anybody got anything further to add to what Danielle just said, or it looks like we've got a couple of people? Andy, looks like yours was up first. I'll start with you.
That's good. The other question I have is around clinical context, and reading through the eRequesting CDI document, there were quite a few places where there was information included that had no reference to eRequesting, and therefore it's quite difficult to make a evaluation of its appropriateness. So one of those examples is around sex and gender. The inclusion of the sex and gender kind of material is interesting, but there's actually nothing in there that gives any guidance on its eRequesting clinical context. And at some point, the eRequesting need is actually, I think, should be the focus of the directions that are documented. And so, for instance, for us in eRequesting, we are not concerned with, for instance, the representation of a request in an EMR. What we are concerned about is the interoperability of a request between a placer and a filler. And so I would, I guess, like to see a little additional requesting context provided so that we can more accurately make technical design decisions in a clinically relevant way.
Okay. I think I'd echo your statements there, Andy. Heather?
I take your point, Andy. It wasn't what I put my hand up for, but I think you're right. We probably missed that. We've included these AUCDI things without explaining the why.
Oh, we've lost your sound, or
Yeah.
I have.
Yeah, no,
somehow.
we've lost your audio there, Heather.
Back.
There we
No,
go,
we've
you're
got
back.
you back.
I'm back.
You're good. You're good.
I was just saying, I take that point. I think you're right. It's something that we've overlooked in providing that context within the eRequesting framework, and it's something that we can certainly add to it. The reason why I put my hand up was to endorse what Danielle said. I mean, when we went through the items for the CDG workshop where we agreed some of these things, I had no idea how this was going to turn out. In fact, the responses from the clinicians were different to what I expected. And we were quite surprised that, I mean, my job was to present the issues around the informatics and the data quality and what we meant by semantics and all of those kinds of things. And I still expected them to say, yes, let's go with yes, or whatever it might be in the short term, knowing that we would work towards the bigger picture with the pregnancy side of things. I mean, there are issues around just having checkboxes. It doesn't convey semantics accurately. And the clinicians took that wholly on board in a way that I never quite expected and pushed back significantly. So, you know, it is what it is, but we didn't expect that as the outcome. We hadn't framed the voting expecting that kind of outcome. We were caught short a little bit, but it was quite a surprise to see the clinicians come into their own and want to shape what the data was. And I think we have to respect that. And we can put that into our documentation representing their views, but it doesn't, I mean, we have to then work out how the CDG and the TDG work together. And it's our job to represent what the clinicians want and to know that we want to scope it in a certain way and what goes into R2 because we want to do it better, more accurately, etc. And I think that's a fair call. But, you know, the TDG needs to work out how you want to engage with the CDG recommendations. And I don't think it will ever be a one-to-one representation that you have to be locked into what the clinicians want, but the clinicians have to be able to document, this is the way we'd like to go forward, this is the way we would like systems to work in the future, and the TDG has to decide how we put that in practice. How you do releases that relate to it or become asynchronous is your business. It has to take into account a whole lot of other things as well. And so that is where I think, you know, we have to work out how to make that work. We give guidance, you have to decide how to interpret that and how to time it and how to frame it and how to sequence it as you need to for implementations. And I think, you know, if we can start to do that dance and keep the relationship between the two close and backwards and forwards, as you said, Danielle, going back to CDG for clarification, etc. I think that's where this kind of process will shine. I don't want to see it as being an antagonistic process. I would really like this to be something where we can be working together, but from two slightly different aspects. And the art of what we do is making them work together. And Sparked is a long way towards that, over and above anything that we've done before. So I'd just like to endorse everyone's efforts. I think this is a spectacular process, but it's not easy. And I hear the tensions. Here to help with the TDG, whatever we can do. Thanks.
Thank you, Heather. Really appreciate that. Thank you. We'll definitely look to ways to work closely together and keep these things moving between our two groups. Definitely. Andy?
Thank you. One more around the requirement versus design kind of continuum. One of the, I think, challenges we're going to have is that some of the way the need is expressed in the document is as a design decision. And I think that creates challenges. So for instance, in representation, many of the representations are making assumptions around how this data will be represented, whereas there may be alternative approaches that are taken which don't directly, I guess, meet that representation expectation if that is the intent. So obviously some of this is around things like representation saying this is a string or this is a codable concept. And while I appreciate using the language of FHIR in some of this, I think it may be a bridge too far in terms of some of the assumptions that are being made. For instance, I think one of the implications for a lot of this work is going to be around how the coding of tests are specified in the approach. And some of these will take up, I think, a lot of some of the data options that are outlined here, and they won't necessarily then be a string representation of that. So I'm not a great fan of including in a requirements document the explicit representations that are needed. I think there's probably a more abstract way of representing that without going down that pathway. Certainly talking about a limited set of codes or something is fine, but I'm not as comfortable with that, the assumptions around representation at this stage. Yeah, I've got one more, I think.
Sure. I think Michael Osborne had some similar questions around coding as well, value sets and things also. Does anybody have anything that they'd like to add to Andy or Heather's points?
I guess could we ask for the eRequesting data for interoperability authors, I guess, to comment on what Andy was saying / asking? Which, I mean, in my perspective, comes a lot back to taking them as clinical data requirements and working them through in a technical space about what we actually need to support within our particular workflows, which sometimes I think means we change the data types. I don't think the data for interoperability, it's not a FHIR model. And sometimes the FHIR requirements mean that we need to put things in a particular data type. And sometimes we're road mapping from here's what systems currently implement into a future data type. I mean, that's my perspective on it, but I'd be interested to hear Heather or Kylene for you to comment on what you're hoping we take into our technical design group discussions about those aspects of the data for interoperability.
Thank you. Heather or Kylene, is there anything that you can sort of add or any comments that you want to make around that?
Kylene or I?
You go.
I think, Andy, it's not a requirements document. I think that's where we differ. What we're building are logical models, and it's going a step further from the requirements into building the logical models, and that's why you have the representations as they are. And that's the tooling that's being built out to support it, that Brett's helping with, that we are actually building logical models, just not documentation of clinical ideas. And that's why it's a lot more specific. So it's not intended to try to take over the FHIR representation at all, but to certainly inform where we think from a clinical point of view, where we need the option for codes and or free text, etc., where we think it definitely needs to be free text and is represented as a string. So I think that's the intent from where I'm documenting it. Kylene?
Yeah, I think I would agree with all your points, Heather. I don't have much more to add, but yeah.
I guess that takes me to my final point, which is really around scope. And I think we do need some greater clarity then around how because Danielle talked around requirements when kind of talking about this, and I think we need to be clear then on how a logical model, which kind of in my maybe naive understanding of logical models should be unbound to the actual technical manifestation. But obviously, there is a lot in this document that is talking and calling out the direct FHIR representations, for instance, codable concepts and those kind of things. And Kylan, I know you, when you introduced this, you talked about billing as an example, and that's one from a scope perspective that confused me, because on the one hand it said billing is out of scope, and then gave a whole bunch of guidance around even things like the representation of billing should be a string. Billing guidance should be provided as a string, and A, it's not actually very useful as a string, and B, it's out of scope. So I got very confused around those. And I guess in addition, I understand where there is a clinical interest in things like distribution lists and stuff, but I guess I wasn't a champion of the introduction of this protocol perspective into this, because I think almost all of those protocols actually were about this, what we would consider is the operational building blocks of an eRequest. And I think it would make far more sense to extract those out if you do have something separate to say, clinicians have an interest in copy to. That's of interest, but I don't know if it should be a core part of the data requirement. Okay, I won't use the requirement, the data logical model, because I don't think these things are that. And these protocol mechanisms are actually quite a separate beast. So if you wanted, for instance, to have a data element representing urgent contact information, that's one thing. But then to actually introduce the workflow and protocol around it, it kind of makes the initial introductory descriptions that you make around what's in scope and out of scope almost like, well, that doesn't count anymore. We're just moving through it anyway. So maybe that's just me, but I found that rather confusing.
I had a similar concern in was just trying to frame in my mind the scope, and again the distribution list sort of got me, because it's like, well, distribution list is in scope, but I didn't see a requester in scope, and you know, billing was in scope, but you said billing was out of scope, and things like you know, we sort of believe when we go back into the pregnancy thing, but that's in scope, but then date of birth is done in scope, you know, like it. So I sort of understood there was the things that are clinical are in scope, but then there seem to be things that maybe I'm wrong, like date of birth. I would have thought that's clinically required, but it's out of scope, you know. So then it was hard to know what was in and out, because you put billing in, but things like date of birth out, the requester out, but the distribution in. And I know it's early days, but that made it hard to fathom what the scope was.
Yeah, and look, I take your point. I think it's also hard. I think there's the things that they also take for granted. So,
yeah,
like, you know, and then it's like they take those things for granted, but for them, like, we were trying to, you know, represent the really important things to them, but also acknowledge that, like, that is not where we're trying to play. We are trying to play, you know, on the other side, but then also kind of cut off. I don't want to say cut off, but also address those concerns that they had, because they were very vocal about those types of things, like the copy to and the urgent contact list. So, you know, we'll take that on board, and maybe Heather and I can have a chat after the meeting and over the next few weeks about how we could maybe represent it a little bit
I
more
guess
clearly.
that's all lost when you're not in those conversations, and then you're reviewing it. You're like, well, why isn't date of birth included? Yeah, because you weren't in those conversations where it was like, oh, that's just assumed, you know.
Yeah, no, definitely, we'll take that and work on it and come back.
Great, thank you, Heather.
I think it is something that we need to work on collaboratively. The clinical design group does not want to step on your toes. We know that you've done a huge amount of work around patient and date of birth and those kinds of things. And if we were to put that in the document, then it looks like we're trying to shape it. We have actually explicitly said we're excluding that because it's not our domain. and we're assuming that it comes from the Australian national standards already. We take it for granted that there will be a patient and the provider requesting and so on as part of it. So communication around this can be refined, but I think it needs your feedback to the document, and we will gradually work, I guess, the art of how to represent this cleanly and clearly for all stakeholders. We gave it a go, and I'm hearing the feedback we didn't get it quite right, but the scope is clearly described that those things are out of scope because we don't have any say in that. We think it's already been done. The requester and so on is also your business around the logistics. The billing guidance is purely because clinicians want to be able to say, please don't bill my patient privately. I want them bulk billed. They can't afford it. It's a clinical decision. And that's why it's not trying to represent the billing process, but it is providing billing guidance from a clinical point of view. Yeah, it's on the edge of it, but it's definitely something clinicians wanted to be able to say and was something they fill in as part of the request itself. You know, this is a to and fro kind of thing. I think there is a bit of a dance. Reading it may need to be read again. Maybe we weren't clear. There are assumptions on both sides. Please put it in the feedback, and we can try and make it try and improve it.
We definitely will. Just making note of the time. We've got another 5 or 6 minutes. Danielle?
I'll be quick then. I'm thinking we need a way to flag, and this will apply to AECDI, I suspect, as well as eRequesting. Data elements or concepts that are important to the clinical design group, but where we don't want the full fleshed out like logical model to be like there with the data type, like for example, billing guidance in the eRequesting space, because the real how does that happen in an operational sense will be taken through in the implementation specifications. So I think we need a way to, yes, identify those elements, but have them be documented in such a way that they're documented differently to the other logical elements like test names in those data for interoperability specifications.
Great, thank you. Anybody have anything that they want to add to either Heather's, Kylan's, or Danielle's points, or even Angus's and Andy's that have come up? A couple of comments in the chat. That's fantastic. Thank you. I think there's definitely been some interesting points raised in this discussion, and I think maybe as co-chairs and facilitators, it's something we can go back to the table and talk about and find a way that we can interrupt between the two groups and start to move this forward and a little bit more cohesive between the two groups. Is there anybody else that has any further comments or questions or points that they want to make? Andy, Angus, Heather, Kylan, Danielle? No? Fantastic. There is a quick question from Michael in the chat. It says, could pregnancy be a simple yes or null? So only yes if verified.
It was something that we talked to the clinicians about, but again, pregnancy is not a black and white thing. There are so many flavors of it. There are so many nuances of possibilities of being pregnant, etc., that it was deemed something they didn't want to deal with. They wanted to look at the whole environment around pregnancy and document it better in an AU-CDI kind of way. And I guess we've got to just got to hold on to that. It's, yes, I mean, what if you can be pregnant at 3 months or 8 weeks? Sorry, yeah, 8 weeks. And that's got a whole lot of different implications for being 8 months pregnant and what you might do as far as testing. So the yes doesn't help in that kind of situations, those kinds of things. It's just not a simple black and white answer that gives all of the nuance that's required.
I see it more like a flag. It's like an alert, not saying you're pregnant. It's like, be aware, maybe.
But as a clinician, and you know that this person is trying to get pregnant, do you mark them as pregnant just in case?
because they're not pregnant because because you don't know if they are yet. But
they're trying to get pregnant. They're they're doing everything they can.
So if you're in doubt, marketers, yes, it just hands it over to us. Go, are you pregnant? Like, what do you want us to think?
But there's all sorts of nuances. If you start asking that question of the patient and they're not, I mean, there's IVF, losing a baby, it's loaded. Honestly, there's subtleties in there that aren't reflected in a flag. I understand what you're saying. The clinicians were feeling like we had to do things different and better.
We want people to fall into the pit of success, not the pit of failure. It's just, I can't see how withholding even a concern is an advantage. Like, it's too hard for me I can't make decisions, so I'm not. At some point, you get to a point where you go, I'm going to alert you that you need to be concerned about this, rather than like just leaving it off. I mean, in the moment where like we absolutely know you're pregnant, but there's nothing to tell the lab that, in the certainty cases where they're a normal patient, you got a beta HCG, which is in the thousands, and yet there's no way to tell the lab that they're pregnant, bar writing clinical notes.
I mean, the clinicians did say that they could put that stuff in clinical notes, and it was raised about, the time taken between when a form is completed or when the specimen is taken or an image is taken. And the radiologists on the call and other clinicians on the call did kind of raise that as also a reason why that they didn't think it should be included in this release.
Interesting points. Thank you, everyone. We'll, I'm sure there'll be much more discussion on the pregnancy status as we move further down the line. Any final comments from anybody? If not, I'll move on to the next meetings and the next the next set of meetings we have for June. Nope. Perfect. Thank you. So the June meetings, we have the eRequesting TDG starting on the 6th of June. Every eRequesting TDG meeting will be 11 a.m., running for 90 minutes unless the cadence discussion changes. At this point, it's still 90 minutes. So starting on the 6th of June, moving the 11th of June, 20th and 25th, all of the minutes for this meeting will be circulated electronically and posted on the Confluence as well. And we will move those out to you guys as soon as possible and try and get them done today or tomorrow or something like that for you. So if nobody else has anything else further that they'd like to add, I think we can start to call this meeting to a close. Danielle, if that's okay with you as well.
Stuart, did you approve last meeting's minutes?
No, we've got to push those to the next meeting. They were only circulated less than 24 hours.
No worries. Okay.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm good for us to close. I have no further comments.
Perfect. Thank you. I will give everybody back 3 minutes and we'll add all of the actions to the Confluence and we'll get the 2 sets of minutes done for the next TDG and we'll get those approved and moved as well. So thank you for coming, everybody, and we will see you all at the next one. And very big thank you to Kylan and Heather as well. Thanks for your discussions. And Brett, thank you for your discussion points as well. Andy and Angus for your fantastic discussion and points that you've raised from your path perspective as well. So thank you, everybody, and we will see you at the next one.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone.